The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Highgrove House as Charles made his way through the familiar corridors. After 37 years of marriage, he thought he knew every corner of their countryside estate. The old manor had been Camilla's childhood home, inherited from her grandmother, and they had spent countless weekends here away from the chaos of London life. Charles had always admired how Camilla maintained the house's original charm while making subtle improvements. She had an eye for preserving history while creating comfort. The Persian rugs, antique furniture, and oil paintings of long-dead relatives all spoke of a family legacy carefully maintained across generations. That Thursday evening, Camilla was in London attending her book club meeting. Charles had decided to stay behind, using the quiet time to catch up on reading and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. He poured himself a glass of wine and settled into his favorite leather chair in the library, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound classics and modern novels. Around 10 o'clock, he heard an unusual sound coming from somewhere within the house. It was a soft, scraping noise, almost like furniture being moved across wooden floors. Charles set down his book and listened carefully. The sound came again, definitely from upstairs. Curious rather than concerned, he climbed the oak staircase to investigate. The second-floor hallway stretched before him, lined with family portraits and narrow tables holding fresh flowers. Everything appeared normal. He checked each room methodically. Their bedroom, the guest rooms, Camilla's study, but found nothing out of place. As he was about to return downstairs, convinced the sound had been his imagination or perhaps mice in the walls, he noticed something odd about the hallway itself. He had walked this corridor thousands of times, but tonight, something felt different about its proportions. Charles pulled out his phone and used its flashlight to examine the walls more carefully. The wallpaper pattern, a delicate rose design that had been there since his first visit to the house, seemed to have an inconsistency near the far end of the hallway. One section didn't quite align with the rest. He pressed his hand against the wall where the pattern seemed off. To his surprise, the wall yielded slightly under pressure. It wasn't solid plaster as he had always assumed. Running his fingers along what he now realized was a seam, he discovered a small, almost invisible latch hidden behind a fold in the wallpaper. The latch turned easily, as if it had been used recently. A section of the wall swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow doorway. Beyond it lay darkness and the musty smell of a space that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Charles stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. In all their years together, Camilla had never mentioned a hidden room. He called out her name, though he knew she wasn't home, as if she might somehow appear to explain this discovery. Using his phone's light, he stepped through the doorway into what appeared to be a small anteroom. The space was barely large enough for one person, with wooden floors and plain white walls. Another door faced him, this one made of heavy oak with brass fittings. The second door was locked, but Charles noticed a key hanging from a small hook beside it. The key was old and ornate, clearly original to the house. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock and turned. The mechanism clicked open with surprising ease. What he found beyond that second door took his breath away. The hidden room was larger than he had expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with a low ceiling supported by dark wooden beams. But it wasn't the size that shocked him. It was the contents. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in precise rows and columns. Charles moved closer, his phone light revealing image after image. They were all of him. Some photos appeared to be taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Others seemed to have been captured without his knowledge during private moments. There he was having lunch with his business partners, walking through Hyde Park, getting into his car outside the office, sitting in their garden reading the newspaper. The earliest photos, judging by his appearance and clothing, seemed to date back at least 15 years. The most recent ones looked like they had been taken just weeks ago. Someone had been documenting his movements, his habits, his daily routine with obsessive detail. Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the hidden room. He moved along the walls, studying the photographs more closely. Each one was labeled with a date and location written in neat handwriting. The writing was elegant, precise, and heartbreakingly familiar. It was Camilla's handwriting. But the photographs weren't the only contents of the room. Against one wall stood a desk, and upon it lay several thick journals. Charles opened the first one with shaking hands. The journal entries were also in Camilla's handwriting. The earliest entry was dated 16 years ago, just a year after they had married. He read the first few lines and felt his world begin to tilt. The subject maintains regular routines, the entry began. Leaves for work at 7:15 a.m. each weekday. Takes the same route through Regent's Park. Lunch typically at the club on Tuesdays and Fridays. Shows no awareness of surveillance. Charles's knees felt weak. He sank into the chair at the desk and continued reading. Entry after entry described his movements, his conversations, his habits, all written in the clinical tone of someone conducting research rather than the loving observations of a wife. As he read deeper into the journal, the entries became more detailed and personal. Camilla had recorded not just where he went and what he did, but how he reacted to various situations. She noted when he seemed happy, when he was stressed, what made him laugh, what annoyed him. Subject shows increased anxiety when discussing financial matters, read one entry from 3 years ago. Noticed tension in jaw muscles and rapid blinking pattern. Potential pressure point for future reference. Future reference for what? Charles's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was reading. This wasn't the behavior of a loving wife trying to understand her husband better. This was systematic surveillance and analysis. He opened a second journal and found entries that were even more disturbing. These focused on his relationships with other people, his friends, colleagues, family members. Camilla had documented private conversations, analyzed his emotional responses to different people, and made detailed notes about his vulnerabilities. Subject becomes defensive when mother criticizes his career choices, one entry noted. Emotional response stronger than expected. Mother remains significant influence despite subject's protests to contrary. Relationship could be leveraged if needed. Leveraged for what? Charles felt sick as he continued reading. The woman he had loved and trusted completely had been studying him like a laboratory specimen for years. Every intimate moment, every shared confidence, every vulnerable admission had been cataloged and analyzed. The third journal contained entries about their marriage itself. Camilla had documented their arguments, their romantic moments, their major decisions. But again, it was all written from the perspective of an observer rather than a participant. Subject responds well to physical affection when under stress, one entry read. Light touch on shoulder or brief kiss reduces visible tension by approximately 60%. Most effective when timed to appear spontaneous rather than calculated. Charles realized that many of the loving gestures he had treasured from his wife might have been carefully planned manipulations. The comforting touch during a difficult business meeting, the surprise dinner when he was feeling overwhelmed, the gentle words of encouragement at just the right moment. Had any of it been genuine? He looked around the room again, taking in the full scope of what Camilla had created. This wasn't just a collection of memories, or even an obsession. This was a systematic intelligence operation conducted by his own wife against him. But why? What could she possibly hope to gain from such elaborate surveillance? They had been happy together, or at least he had thought they were. They shared interests, friends, a comfortable lifestyle. What need could drive someone to spy on their own spouse with such dedication and detail? Charles noticed a fourth journal, thicker than the others and more recently written in. This one was labeled Project Completion in gold letters on the cover. His hands shook as he opened it. The first entry was dated just 6 months ago. 16 years of data collection nearly complete. Subjects' patterns, vulnerabilities, and psychological profile thoroughly documented. Emotional bonds with subject deeper than anticipated, but mission parameters unchanged. Final phase preparation to begin within 90 days. Final phase? Mission parameters? Charles felt as if he were reading about himself in the pages of a spy novel, but this was real. This was his life, his marriage, his wife, writing about him as if he were a target rather than a husband. He flipped through more pages, finding technical diagrams, financial documents, and what appeared to be escape routes marked on maps of London and the surrounding countryside. There were bank account numbers, false identification documents, and detailed plans for what looked like a sophisticated disappearance. Near the back of the journal, he found a series of photographs that made his blood run cold. They showed him entering and leaving his office building, but unlike the surveillance photos on the walls, these had been marked up with red lines indicating sight lines, security camera positions, and potential approach routes. The final pages contained a timeline. According to Camilla's notes, project completion was scheduled to culminate in just 3 weeks, coinciding with their planned anniversary trip to Scotland. The remote cottage they had booked for what he thought would be a romantic getaway was marked on a map, with notes about its isolation and distance from the nearest police station. Charles sat back in the chair, his mind reeling. The woman he had shared his life with for nearly 4 decades wasn't who she appeared to be. The love he thought they shared might have been an elaborate performance. Their entire marriage might have been built on deception. But there were still so many questions. Who was Camilla really? Who did she work for? What was the ultimate purpose of all this surveillance and planning? And most terrifying of all, what did she intend to do to him in Scotland? As he sat in the hidden room surrounded by evidence of his wife's betrayal, Charles heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Camilla was home early from her book club meeting. He quickly photographed several pages from the journals with his phone, returned everything to its original position, and made his way out of the hidden room. His hands fumbled with the latches as he sealed the secret door, restoring the wallpaper to its normal appearance. By the time Camilla's key turned in the front door lock, Charles was back in the library, his book open on his lap, as if he had never moved. But everything had changed. The woman calling out her cheerful greeting as she hung up her coat was a stranger to him now. "Darling, I'm home. How was your quiet evening?" Charles looked up as she entered the library, her familiar smile warm and loving. She looked exactly as she always had, his Camilla, his partner, his best friend. But now he saw the performance behind the smile, the calculation behind the warmth. "Perfectly peaceful," he managed to say, his voice sounding normal despite the chaos in his mind. "How was book club?" "Oh, you know how it is," she replied, settling into her usual chair across from him. "Margaret dominated the discussion as usual, and Sandra brought those terrible biscuits again. I'm glad to be home." As she chatted about her evening, Charles studied her face carefully, looking for some sign of the deception he now knew lay beneath the surface. But she was flawless in her performance, giving no indication that she was anything other than the devoted wife she had always appeared to be. The next few hours felt surreal. They had their usual cup of tea together before bed, discussed their plans for the weekend, and went through their normal nighttime routine. Charles lay beside her in their bed, listening to her steady breathing, wondering how many nights he had shared this intimacy with someone who was essentially a stranger. When he was certain she was asleep, Charles slipped out of bed and retreated to his study. He needed time to think, to process what he had discovered, and to decide what to do next. The anniversary trip to Scotland was just 3 weeks away. According to Camilla's notes, whatever she had been planning for 16 years was scheduled to conclude during that trip. He had 3 weeks to figure out who his wife really was and what she intended to do to him. 3 weeks to decide whether to confront her, run, or play along with whatever deadly game she had been orchestrating. As he sat in his study in the pre-dawn darkness, Charles realized that his life, as he had known it, was over. The question now was whether he would survive long enough to build a new one. The following morning brought no relief from the previous night's revelations. Charles sat at the breakfast table, mechanically buttering his toast, while watching Camilla move around their kitchen with practiced efficiency. She hummed softly as she prepared her tea, the same melody she had hummed for years. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing would ever be normal again. "You seem distracted this morning, darling," Camilla observed, settling into her chair across from him. "Didn't you sleep well?" Charles forced himself to meet her eyes. "Just thinking about work. The Morrison account is giving me some trouble." "Perhaps you should delegate more," she suggested, her tone filled with what seemed like genuine concern. "You've been carrying too much responsibility lately." How easily the lies came to her, Charles thought. How perfectly she played the role of caring wife. He wondered if she had practiced these conversations, if his responses were part of some larger script she had written years ago. After Camilla left for her morning yoga class, Charles retreated to his study and locked the door. He had spent most of the night thinking about his next steps, and he had settled on a plan. If his wife had been conducting surveillance on him for 16 years, it was time for him to return the favor. He started by researching private investigators online. After careful consideration, he chose a discreet firm that specialized in background checks and surveillance. The woman who answered their phone spoke with a professional calm that Charles found reassuring. "I need someone investigated," he said without preamble. "Someone close to me. It needs to be completely confidential." "We understand the sensitive nature of such situations," the investigator replied. "When can you come in to discuss the details?" Charles arranged to meet with them that afternoon, using a business appointment as his cover story. He spent the morning gathering everything he could about Camilla's background: documents, photographs, addresses of places she had lived before they married. As he searched through their home office, Charles realized how little he actually knew about his wife's past. She had always been somewhat vague about her childhood, claiming it was too painful to discuss in detail. He had respected her privacy, never pushing for information she seemed reluctant to share. Now he saw that privacy in a different light. The woman who had been documenting every detail of his life for years had successfully kept her own past completely hidden from him. The meeting with the private investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, proved enlightening in ways Charles hadn't expected. "I'll be direct with you," Patricia said after Charles had explained his situation. "What you're describing sounds less like marital infidelity and more like professional intelligence work. The level of documentation, the systematic approach, the long-term planning. This isn't the behavior of someone having an affair or even someone with mental health issues." "What are you suggesting?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Your wife may be a trained operative of some kind. Corporate espionage, government intelligence, organized crime. There are several possibilities. The question is what information or access you have that someone would spend 16 years trying to obtain." Charles considered this. He was successful in his business, but he wasn't involved in anything sensitive enough to warrant such elaborate attention. He wasn't a government official or defense contractor. He didn't have access to state secrets or classified information. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "We start with a complete background investigation on your wife. Real name, education, employment history, family connections, everything. In cases like this, people often discover their spouse's entire identity was fabricated." The thought sent a chill through Charles. "How long will this take?" "For a preliminary report, about a week. But given what you've told me about the timeline in her notes, I'd recommend we also set up counter-surveillance immediately. If she's planning something in 3 weeks, we need to know if she's aware of your discovery." Charles agreed to both courses of action. Patricia assigned one of her best investigators to begin the background check immediately, while arranging for discreet surveillance of both Charles and Camilla to monitor for any changes in their routines or behavior. Returning home, Charles found the house empty. Camilla had left a note saying she was having lunch with her sister, Margaret, and would be back by 4. Charles used the opportunity to return to the hidden room. In daylight, filtering through a small window he hadn't noticed the night before, the room looked even more sinister. The photographs covering the walls created an oppressive atmosphere, like being watched by hundreds of eyes. Charles forced himself to study them more carefully, looking for patterns or clues he might have missed. Many of the photos had been taken from their own home. He recognized the view from their bedroom window, the angle from their garden shed, the perspective from the guest room upstairs. Camilla had been photographing him from within their own house, documenting his private moments when he thought he was unobserved. In one corner of the room, Charles discovered a small cabinet he had overlooked the night before. Inside, he found additional materials that made his blood run cold. There were detailed floor plans of his office building, including security protocols and staff schedules. There were copies of his medical records, financial statements, and legal documents. Most disturbing of all, there were several vials of clear liquid with medical labels he didn't recognize. Charles carefully photographed everything with his phone, making sure to capture every detail. The vials particularly troubled him. Why would Camilla have medical supplies hidden away? The labels indicated they were prescription medications, but the names meant nothing to him. As he was about to leave the room, Charles noticed something else. Behind the desk, partially hidden by shadows, was a small safe. It was old-fashioned, with a combination lock that looked like it belonged in a bank from decades past. He tried several combinations, their anniversary, Camilla's birthday, his birthday, but none worked. Finally, on impulse, he tried the date of their first meeting. The lock clicked open. Inside the safe, Charles found documents that shattered what remained of his understanding of his marriage. There was a passport in Camilla's photograph, but with a different name, Elena Kowalski. The birth date was 5 years earlier than what he had always believed to be her age. There were bank statements showing accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands containing millions of pounds. There were several other passports with different names, but Camilla's photo, and there was a thick folder labeled Charles Morrison, Asset File. With shaking hands, Charles opened the file. It contained detailed psychological profiles, financial assessments, and what appeared to be operational plans dating back to before they had even met. According to the documents, their chance encounter at a mutual friend's dinner party had been carefully orchestrated. The file included surveillance photos of Charles from weeks before their first meeting. Someone had been watching him, studying his habits and preferences, preparing for an operation to get close to him. That operation had been their entire marriage. At the back of the file was a document that made Charles sink into the desk chair in shock. It was a contract, written in what appeared to be Russian, with an English translation attached. The contract outlined payment schedules for a 16-year operation to monitor and ultimately eliminate Asset C, clearly referring to Charles himself. The elimination was scheduled to take place during their anniversary trip to Scotland, made to look like an accident during a hiking excursion. The isolated location had been chosen specifically for its remoteness and the plausibility of a fatal fall. Charles felt physically sick as he read the clinical details of his planned murder. Every aspect had been carefully considered. The weather conditions that would make a fall more believable. The timing that would ensure his body wouldn't be found for days. Even the insurance implications that would benefit his grieving widow. But the most devastating revelation was in the final pages of the file. The operation wasn't about money or corporate secrets or government intelligence. According to the documents, Charles had been targeted because of something his father had done during World War II. His father, James Morrison, had apparently been involved in operations against Soviet agents in London during the 1940s. Several Russian operatives had been captured and executed as a result of James's intelligence work. Charles's elimination was revenge for actions taken more than 70 years ago by a man who had been dead for 15 years. The sins of the father, Charles thought numbly, his entire life, his marriage, his love for Camilla. All of it had been orchestrated to settle a decades-old score that he had known nothing about. As the implications sank in, Charles heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Camilla was returning from lunch. He quickly photographed the most important documents, returned everything to the safe, and sealed the hidden room. By the time Camilla entered the house, Charles was in his study, ostensibly working on business papers. But his hands shook as he tried to type, and he could barely focus on the screen. "How was your afternoon?" Camilla asked, appearing in his doorway with her familiar warm smile. "Fine," Charles managed. "Just catching up on some work. How was Margaret?" "Same as always, full of complaints about her husband's retirement plans," Camilla replied with a laugh. "I sometimes think we're lucky not to have that problem." They would never have that problem, Charles thought bitterly, because according to her plans, he would be dead in 3 weeks. That evening, as they sat together in the living room watching television, Charles studied his wife's face with new eyes. The woman he had loved for nearly 4 decades wasn't real. Elena Kowalski was a professional killer who had spent 16 years preparing to murder him for crimes he had never committed. Yet looking at her, Charles still saw traces of the woman he had fallen in love with. Her laugh was still genuine when something amused her. She still reached for his hand during emotional scenes in movies. She still made his favorite meal when he was stressed. Had any of it been real? Had Elena Kowalski, professional assassin, somehow developed genuine feelings for her target over the course of 16 years? Or was she simply that good at her job? The question haunted Charles as he lay in bed that night, listening to Camilla's steady breathing beside him. He wondered if she dreamed about their life together or about the mission she was preparing to complete. The next morning brought a call from Patricia Wells. "We've found some preliminary information about your wife," she said. "Can you meet this afternoon? There are things we need to discuss that shouldn't be handled over the phone." Charles arranged to meet Patricia at a discreet cafe across town. What she told him there confirmed his worst fears and revealed new horrors he hadn't anticipated. "Your wife's real name is Elena Kowalski," Patricia began. "She's a former intelligence operative, trained in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. According to our sources, she specialized in long-term deep cover operations." "What kind of operations?" Charles asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Assassination, primarily. Her specialty was eliminating targets through methods that appeared accidental or natural. She was considered one of their best operatives before the Soviet Union collapsed." "But that was decades ago. Why would she still be active?" Patricia's expression grew grim. "Because some operations never end, Mr. Morrison. Your wife appears to be working for what remains of the old Soviet intelligence networks. They've been systematically eliminating people connected to operations that damaged their interests during the Cold War." "My father," Charles said quietly. "Your father's work in London during the 1940s resulted in significant losses for Soviet intelligence. They've been patient, but they haven't forgotten. You were targeted not for anything you've done, but for what your father did 70 years ago." The weight of this revelation settled over Charles like a physical burden. His marriage, his life, his future, all sacrificed to settle a score from before he was even born. "What can I do?" he asked. "You have several options," Patricia replied. You can go to the authorities, but proving any of this will be difficult, and it might push your wife to accelerate her timeline. You can disappear, but she's had 16 years to study your habits and psychology. She'll likely find you. What's the third option? Patricia leaned forward. You can play along with her plan, but with backup. We set up surveillance and intervention capabilities for your Scotland trip. When she makes her move, we'll be ready. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is. But it may be your best chance to survive this and see her brought to justice. Running will only delay the inevitable, and going to the police now gives her too much warning to escape. Charles spent the rest of the afternoon walking through London, trying to process everything he had learned. The city he had lived in his entire life felt different now, full of shadows and potential threats. Every person on the street could be watching him, reporting back to Elena about his movements and behavior. When he returned home that evening, Camilla was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Perfect timing," she said. "I'm making your favorite, lamb with rosemary and garlic." As she bustled around the kitchen, chattering about her day, Charles marveled at her performance. Knowing what he now knew, he could see subtle signs of her training, the way she positioned herself to keep exits in view, how her eyes constantly scanned for threats, the unconscious way she kept potential weapons within reach. But there were other things, too. She still hummed while she cooked, still saved the best portions for him, still asked about his day with apparent genuine interest. After 16 years, perhaps Elena Kowalski had become Camilla Morrison in ways even she didn't fully understand. Over dinner, she brought up their upcoming anniversary trip. "I've been thinking about our Scotland plans," she said. "I found some wonderful hiking trails near the cottage. The views are supposed to be spectacular." "That sounds lovely," Charles replied, forcing enthusiasm into his voice while knowing she was describing the location where she planned to kill him. "There's one trail in particular that leads to a beautiful overlook," Camilla continued. "It's a bit challenging, but I know how much you enjoy a good hike." Charles nodded and smiled, playing his part in the deadly script she had written. But now he was writing his own script, too, with Patricia Wells and her team preparing to ensure that the story ended differently than Elena Kowalski had planned. As the days passed, Charles found himself living two lives simultaneously. On the surface, he continued his normal routine, going to work, having dinner with Camilla, making plans for their anniversary trip. But underneath, he was preparing for what might be the last performance of his life. Patricia's team conducted regular briefings, mapping out every detail of the Scotland cottage and surrounding area. They identified observation points, escape routes, and intervention strategies. Charles practiced different scenarios, learning how to signal for help and how to defend himself if necessary. Meanwhile, he watched Camilla with new eyes, studying her as carefully as she had studied him. He began to see the subtle preparations she was making, the special hiking boots she purchased, the first aid supplies she packed, the detailed maps of the area she studied with apparent casual interest. The most chilling moment came when he watched her practice concerned expressions in their bathroom mirror, preparing her performance as the grieving widow who had witnessed her husband's tragic accident. But there were other moments, too, that continued to confuse him. Times when she seemed to let her guard down, when genuine emotion flickered across her face. Once, he caught her looking at their wedding photos with what appeared to be real sadness, as if she were mourning something that hadn't happened yet. 10 days before their Scotland trip, Charles made a decision that Patricia had advised against. He decided to confront Camilla, not about her true identity or her plans, but about their marriage itself. "Camilla," he said one evening as they sat together in their living room, "do you ever regret anything about our life together?" She looked up from her book, surprised by the question. What a strange thing to ask. Why would you wonder about that? I've been thinking about time lately, how quickly it passes, whether we make the most of the years we have. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. The mask of Camilla Morrison seemed to slip, and Charles glimpsed something deeper underneath. Uncertainty, perhaps even pain. I regret that time moves too quickly, she said quietly. That nothing lasts forever no matter how much we might want it to. In that moment, Charles wondered if Elena Kowalski had fallen in love with her target, creating an impossible situation where completing her mission would destroy something she had come to value. The thought gave him no comfort, love or no love. According to her detailed plans, he would still be dead in 10 days. But it did give him hope that the woman he had married, even if she had been created as a cover identity, had somehow become real enough to struggle with what she had been sent to do. As their departure date approached, Charles found himself caught between fear and strange anticipation. Soon, after 16 years of deception and 3 weeks of revelation, he would finally learn the truth about the woman he had shared his life with. Whether he survived that truth remained to be seen. The cottage in Scotland sat perched on a hillside overlooking Loch Katrina, exactly as beautiful and remote as Camilla had described. The drive from London had taken most of the day, and they arrived as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water. To any outside observer, they would have appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be. A couple celebrating their anniversary with a romantic getaway. Charles carried their bags into the cottage while Camilla stood on the small porch, breathing in the Highland air with apparent satisfaction. She looked relaxed and genuinely happy, but Charles now recognized the signs of her professional assessment. The way she noted the sight lines to neighboring properties, the isolation of their location, the nearest road access. "It's perfect," she said as he joined her on the porch. "Tomorrow we can explore those hiking trails I mentioned. The weather forecast is ideal." Charles nodded, knowing that the weather forecast was indeed ideal for what she had planned. Clear skies and dry conditions would make a hiking accident more believable. And the good weather would ensure they would be alone on the trails. Inside the cottage, Charles went through the motions of settling in while his mind raced through the plans Patricia's team had made. They were positioned strategically around the area, maintaining visual contact with the cottage while remaining invisible. Charles wore a small GPS tracking device disguised as a regular fitness watch, and he carried a panic button designed to look like an inhaler. As evening approached, Camilla prepared dinner in the cottage's small kitchen. Charles watched her move around the space with practiced efficiency, opening a bottle of wine and setting the table by the window overlooking the loch. Everything felt surreal, the domesticity of the scene at odds with what he knew was planned for the following day. "To 37 wonderful years," Camilla said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "And to many more," Charles replied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. As they ate, Camilla chatted about the area's history, the hiking trails they would explore, and the peaceful atmosphere of the cottage. Her performance was flawless, but Charles noticed something else beneath it, a tension that seemed to increase as the evening progressed. After dinner, they sat together on the small sofa, Camilla reading while Charles pretended to work on his laptop. But he found himself studying her profile in the lamplight, wondering what thoughts were going through her mind. Was she reviewing her plans for tomorrow, feeling nervous about the mission she had prepared for 16 years? Or was some part of her dreading what she knew she had to do? Around 10 o'clock, Camilla closed her book and stretched. "I think I'll have a bath and get to bed early," she said. "We should start our hike by 8 tomorrow to make the most of the day." Charles nodded, knowing that 8 o'clock was precisely the time she had calculated would put them at the predetermined location when lighting and weather conditions were optimal for her purposes. As Camilla ran her bath, Charles used the opportunity to send a brief text message to Patricia. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. start as planned. All systems ready." The response came quickly. "Team in position. Stay alert and trust the plan." Charles lay in bed that night listening to Camilla's steady breathing, wondering if she was truly asleep or simply waiting. Every small sound seemed amplified: the settling of the cottage timbers, the wind through the highland heather, the distant call of night birds over the loch. At some point during the night, Charles must have dozed, because he woke to find morning light filtering through the cottage windows and the smell of coffee and bacon coming from the kitchen. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Camilla called out cheerfully. "I thought we'd need a good breakfast before our adventure today." She had prepared a full Scottish breakfast with obvious care, and Charles realized this might be the last meal they would ever share together. The thought gave every bite a strange poignancy, even as his stomach churned with anticipation of what was to come. After breakfast, they prepared for their hike. Camilla had laid out weather-appropriate clothing and checked their backpack supplies with what appeared to be loving concern for their safety and comfort. Charles marveled at the irony. The woman planning to kill him was making sure he was properly equipped for a mountain hike. The trail began just behind the cottage, winding upward through stands of Scots pine and across open moorland dotted with purple heather. The morning was indeed perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, excellent visibility. Camilla set a steady pace, occasionally stopping to point out scenic views or interesting wildlife. "There's supposed to be a spectacular overlook about 2 hours up the trail," she mentioned, as they paused beside a small stream. "The views of the loch are meant to be breathtaking." Charles knew from his briefings with Patricia that the overlook was their destination, a cliff face with a 60-foot drop to jagged rocks below. According to the timeline in Camilla's notes, she planned to stage his accident there around 10:30 in the morning. As they climbed higher, Charles found himself hyper-aware of every detail. The way Camilla occasionally checked her watch, the manner in which she positioned herself on the trail to stay behind him, the careful way she avoided leaving clear footprints in soft ground. Her training was subtle but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. But there were other things, too, that continued to puzzle him. Several times he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not calculation or cold assessment, but something that looked almost like regret or sadness. When she thought he wasn't looking, her mask of cheerful enthusiasm sometimes slipped, revealing something more complex underneath. At 10:15, they reached the overlook. The view was indeed spectacular. Loch Katrina stretched out below them like a mirror, reflecting the highland peaks and the handful of white clouds drifting across the azure sky. The cliff edge offered an unobstructed vista in all directions, and Charles understood why Camilla had chosen this location. The beauty of the scene would make his death seem like a tragic accident, a man so taken by the magnificent view that he stepped too close to the edge. "It's incredible," Charles said, playing his part while acutely aware of Camilla moving to a position behind him and slightly to his left. "Yes," she replied, her voice strangely quiet. "It's the kind of place that makes you think about what really matters in life." Charles turned to look at her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he saw cracks in her composure. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her breathing seemed forced. "Camilla," he said gently, "is everything all right?" For a moment, she didn't answer. She stood looking out over the loch, her expression cycling through emotions Charles had never seen before: pain, uncertainty, something that looked like internal conflict. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Charles, there's something I need to tell you." This wasn't part of the script Charles had expected. According to her plans, he should have been dead by now, his body tumbling down the cliff face while she prepared her performance as the horrified witness. "What is it?" he asked. Camilla turned to face him fully, and Charles saw tears in her eyes. "My name isn't Camilla Morrison," she said. "It's Elena Kowalski, and I came into your life to kill you." The words hung in the Highland air between them like a physical presence. Charles felt his heart racing, unsure whether this was genuine confession or simply a new tactical approach. "I know," he said quietly. Camilla's eyes widened in shock. "You know? I found your hidden room 3 weeks ago. I know about the surveillance, the journals, the planned accident. I know about my father and why you were sent after me." For a long moment, they stood facing each other on the cliff edge. 37 years of marriage reduced to this moment of truth. "Then why did you come here?" Elena asked. "Why didn't you run or go to the police?" "Because I needed to understand," Charles replied. "I needed to know if any of it was real. Our marriage, our life together, was any of it genuine?" Elena's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto a nearby boulder. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've been asking myself the same question for months. When I started this mission, everything was clear. You were a target, nothing more. But 16 years. 16 years of living with someone, sharing meals and conversations and quiet moments." She looked up at him with anguish in her eyes. "I fell in love with you, Charles. I tried not to. I fought against it. But somewhere along the way, Elena Kowalski became Camilla Morrison, and she fell in love with her husband." Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, anger, and something that might have been hope. "But you were still planning to kill me," he said. "Yes," Elena admitted, "because that's who I am. That's what I was trained to be. I thought I could separate my feelings from my mission, complete the job I was sent to do, and then, I don't know, disappear and try to forget. And now?" Elena looked at him with eyes full of pain. "Now I realize I can't do it. I've spent weeks preparing myself, going through the motions, but standing here, I can't kill the man I love for crimes his father committed before he was born." Charles felt some of the tension leave his body, but he remained cautious. This could still be manipulation, another layer of performance in a game he barely understood. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," Elena replied honestly. "My handlers will be expecting confirmation of mission completion. When they don't receive it, they'll send someone else. You'll never be safe as long as they believe you need to die. Then we need to convince them otherwise." "How?" Charles had been hoping she would ask that question. "By faking my death convincingly enough that they believe their mission is complete." Elena stared at him. "You would do that? Give up your identity, your life, everything you've built? To be free of this threat? Yes. The question is whether you're willing to help me disappear." Before Elena could answer, Charles heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the crack of a rifle shot echoing across the Highland Valley. Elena spun toward the sound, her training immediately taking over. "Get down!" she shouted, pushing Charles behind a large boulder as a second shot rang out. "What's happening?" Charles asked, though part of him suspected he already knew. "My handlers," Elena replied grimly, pulling a pistol from her backpack with practiced efficiency. "They must have been monitoring the operation. When I didn't complete the mission on schedule, they sent backup." More shots rang out from multiple directions, and Charles realized they were surrounded by professional killers who had come to finish what Elena couldn't bring herself to do. "How many?" Charles asked. "At least 3, probably more," Elena replied, scanning the terrain with professional assessment. "They've got high ground positions and automatic weapons. We're trapped." It was then that Charles made a decision that surprised even him. "No, we're not," he said, pulling out his panic button. "I have backup too." Elena stared at him in amazement as he activated the device. Within seconds, return fire erupted from concealed positions around the overlook. Patricia's team had been waiting for exactly this scenario. What followed was a brief but intense firefight between two groups of professionals. Charles and Elena pressed themselves against the boulder, listening to the sound of bullets ricocheting off rocks and the sharp commands being shouted in multiple languages. "You hired protection?" Elena asked during a brief lull in the shooting. "A private security firm," Charles confirmed. "I wasn't sure if you would go through with your mission or not, but I wanted to be prepared either way." The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, Patricia Wells approached their position, her team having successfully eliminated or captured Elena's former colleagues. "Are you both all right?" Patricia asked, though she kept her weapon trained on Elena. "We're fine," Charles replied, "but the situation has become more complicated." Over the next hour, as Patricia's team secured the area and dealt with the aftermath of the confrontation, Charles explained what had happened between him and Elena. The confession, the change of heart, the revelation that their marriage had somehow become real despite its false foundation. Patricia listened with professional skepticism. "Mr. Morrison, I understand this is emotionally complicated, but this woman was sent to kill you. Her handlers just tried to complete that mission. She's a trained assassin who has been deceiving you for 16 years. "I know all of that," Charles replied, "but I also know that she saved my life just now. She could have let those men finish their job, but instead she protected me." Patricia turned to Elena, who had been silent during this exchange. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Patricia asked. Elena looked up with eyes that seemed older and more tired than Charles had ever seen them. "Everything Mr. Morrison said is true," she replied. "I was sent here to kill him and I couldn't do it. My feelings for him became stronger than my loyalty to the mission. I know that doesn't excuse 16 years of deception, but it's the truth." Patricia considered this for several long moments. "What do you propose we do?" she asked Charles. "Help us disappear," Charles said. "Both of us. Elena's former organization will never stop hunting her now that she's betrayed them. And they'll never stop hunting me as long as they think I'm alive. We need new identities, a new life somewhere they can't find us." Patricia looked between them with something that might have been admiration for the complexity of the situation. "It's possible," she said finally. "Difficult and expensive, but possible. You'd have to give up everything, your business, your friends, your family connections. You'd essentially have to die and be reborn as entirely different people." Charles looked at Elena, who met his gaze with something that looked like hope. "Would you do that?" he asked her. "Start over completely? Try to build something real together?" Elena was quiet for a long time before answering. "Yes," she said finally. "If you can forgive me for 16 years of lies, I would like to try to spend however many years I have left telling you the truth." 6 months later, a couple named David and Sarah Chen celebrated their first wedding anniversary in a small coastal town in New Zealand. To their neighbors, they were retired academics who had moved there for the peaceful lifestyle and beautiful scenery. David taught mathematics at the local secondary school, while Sarah worked as a librarian and tended to their small garden. They were quiet, private people who seemed devoted to each other and grateful for their simple life. Sometimes, late at night when they thought they were unobserved, they could be seen walking hand in hand along the beach, two people who had found something real in the midst of decades of deception and betrayal. They never spoke about their former lives, the hidden room, or the confrontation on a Scottish cliff that had changed everything. That Charles Morrison and Elena Kowalski had died on that highland overlook, victims of a conspiracy that had consumed far too many years. But David and Sarah Chen were building something new, a relationship based on truth instead of surveillance, on choice rather than mission parameters, on love that had somehow grown in the darkest soil imaginable. It wasn't perfect. Trust, once shattered, takes time to rebuild. There were moments when David would catch Sarah looking at him with the analytical gaze of a former operative, and times when she would notice him studying her as if trying to separate the real woman from the performance he had lived with for so long. But they were trying, one honest conversation at a time, to create something neither of them had ever had before, a genuine partnership between two people who chose each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. On quiet evenings, as they sat together watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, both David and Sarah sometimes wondered if they could ever fully escape their past. The old Soviet networks were patient and had long memories. Somewhere in the world, people might still be looking for Charles Morrison and Elena Kowalski. But for now, in this moment, they were free to be themselves, whoever that turned out to be, in a way neither had ever experienced before. The story of Charles and Camilla Morrison had ended in tragedy and betrayal, but the story of David and Sarah Chen was just beginning, built on a foundation of truth, forgiveness, and the remarkable discovery that love could somehow grow even in the most impossible circumstances. As Sarah had written in the final entry in her hidden journals, the ones she had burned before leaving their old life forever, some missions cannot be completed because completing them would destroy everything that makes the mission worthwhile. Today I choose love over loyalty, truth over training, and hope over the history that has controlled too much of my life. Whatever comes next, at least it will be real. And for the first time in either of their lives, real was enough.